Spider-Man is one of the most popular superheroes ever created, so it's really no surprise that he's one of the comic book characters with the most adaptations outside the comics. He had his first solo animated series made in 1967, just 5 short years after he was created, and in the years since he's had 10 entire animated shows solely focused on him, and it's soon to be 11 shows. But out of all of these adaptations, there's one incarnation of the character that was so beloved and well received that is considered by some to be the most faithful adaptation that Spider-Man has ever gotten. Of course, I'm talking about the great 2008 animated series, The Spectacular Spider-Man, a show that was tragically cut short after its second season, despite being praised by both critics and fans ever since it released. However, there's a lot of details that we've come to know about its planned season 3 that we never got to see, but many of its ideas had already been set up and hinted at through careful foreshadowing, and the introduction of many minor supporting characters who were actually setups for many planned storylines the show's producers never got to do. So today we're gonna take a retrospective through Spectacular Spider-Man's production and development history to see just how things could have been had the series continued. Season 1 of Spectacular Spider-Man introduced us to a teenage Peter Parker who's been active as a superhero for a few months. He got bitten by a radioactive spider at the beginning of summer, then lost Uncle Ben shortly after that, and spent the entire summer getting accustomed to his new powers as Spider-Man, with the show beginning as Peter starts his junior year of high school. This was something pretty noteworthy at the time, since up until then we hadn't seen many Spider-Man adaptations that focused on his first stories as a teenager. They usually adapted him as a fully grown man, and even in the first Sam Raimi movie he was portrayed as a senior in high school shortly before graduating. It wasn't until recent years where we started to see more Peter Parker adaptations that actually showed him in his teens, such as Spectacular Spider-Man, where they chose to follow the early adventures of a 16-year-old as he learns how to be a hero, and how to balance his responsibilities as Spider-Man with his personal life as Peter Parker. This decision to showcase a teen Spider-Man also ties into a major theme from the entire show, which is the education of Peter Parker, with Peter constantly learning new life lessons not only in school, but also in the streets as a superhero, and the new issues he faces in both areas of his life are usually interconnected. This is why some of the show's episodes have titles that are usually school subjects from different courses. The series was worked on by many incredible writers, directors, and artists, but it was mainly developed by producers Victor Cook and Greg Weisman, with Cook mainly being in charge of handling the show's visuals and coordinating with the different directors of each episode, and Weisman mainly working on the series' writing, plotting, and storylines, with himself serving as the head writer of the show. Weisman was also already pretty beloved by animation fans before his involvement in Spectacular Spider-Man, due to him being one of the creators of the 90s animated series Gargoyles, which was also a fantastic show, and his experience working on that project translated incredibly well into Spectacular Spider-Man, given that the series had a great balance between its high-energy, action-packed adventure feel, appropriate for all ages, while also having a good amount of serious themes that were carefully handled and presented with gravity. Spectacular Spider-Man truly presents its themes with a notable sense of sincerity, in large part probably stemming from the creative staff's love and respect for the original source material. In a 2008 interview with IGN, Weisman spoke on his love for Spider-Man and how he personally grew up reading the comics during the Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. run of the character, with him later also reading the original stories crafted during the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko era. Both of these runs from the comics were used as inspiration for Spectacular Spider-Man, since Weisman reread these stories as soon as he got the job as showrunner, and their influence can be felt when you see the show in motion, and even just by looking at the very designs of the characters, who were mainly designed by artist Sean Galloway, whose minimalist and cartoony style may be a little off-putting to some, but I personally really like his designs, and they were especially useful for the animators, and given that the simplified look made it easier for the characters to be animated in such a fluid way, something that really elevated the show's action scenes. The series' art style in particular really harkens back to the Ditko aesthetic of the comics, especially with some details like Spider-Man having webbing under his armpits, something that was usually drawn on Spider-Man while Steve Ditko was on the title. Of course, while the show has a pronounced classic feel to it, with many direct callbacks and references to the 60s original era, The series also takes bits and pieces from many different iterations of the character as well, with the show's writers also mentioning many times how they wanted to take the opportunity of being able to craft a modern, yet classic new Spider-Man world from scratch by condensing many different comic book elements and making a more cohesive universe for these characters. This is why the show does stuff like including Harry Osborn and Gwen Stacy into Peter's high school life, when in the comics, these characters weren't actually introduced until Peter's college years. The series also has an undeniable influence from the Ultimate comics. Of course, I'm talking about the OG line from the 2000s, and not the modern Ultimate comics. Those are really fucking great though. That was another notable new interpretation of Spider-Man in the early 2000s that also reintroduced the character to his old high school setting, which as we've mentioned was pretty novel at the time, since at that point, Peter Parker had been a grown-ass man for decades in the main Marvel universe, so it was pretty fresh seeing Spider-Man as a teenager again. In Spectacular Spider-Man, the ultimate influence can be felt with aspects like Peter and Eddie Brock being childhood friends, or Kraven the Hunter acquiring superpowers by mutating his DNA with animal DNA. Another thing we can't forget is that when Spectacular Spider-Man began production, the Sam Raimi movies were also still being produced and really fresh in people's minds, so the show of course also took some elements from them as well. I really like how they had Uncle Ben himself directly saying to Peter their great responsibility line, just like in the first movie, since, in case you didn't know, Uncle Ben didn't actually say the phrase himself in the original comic. It was said by the omniscient narrator of Spider-Man's first story. In the movie though, they changed this and had Uncle Ben say it, which most people agree is a much better choice, and it was also adapted that way in this show.
Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. With great power, there must also come great responsibility.
Another cool connection with the movies is how they visually adapted the symbiote suit. When Spider-Man first bonded with the symbiote, his suit turned black, but it maintained the webbing throughout his body like in his regular red and blue costume, making this animated version of the black suit look a lot like the black suit from Spider-Man 3. However, one of the coolest details from the show is that, as Peter kept on using the black suit, it started consuming and draining his emotions, making Peter grow increasingly hostile and antisocial. And this was visually represented by having the black suit lose its webbing and get even darker, until the suit was completely black except for its white highlights. And this made their version of the black suit look pretty much identical to how it looked in the original comics. And that's really awesome. I just love how the show's creators are such a huge Spider-Man fans that they found a way to adapt both versions of the black suit in such a creative way. The inclusion of the original black suit look is another example of Spectacular Spider-Man's adherence to the source material, but this is something that's well ingrained deep inside the show's spirit. Its entire vibe truly feels like a modernized reinterpretation of Spidey's classic adventures, and they made sure to create a world that is fleshed out in such a way that feels like it's truly lived in and expands far beyond what Spider-Man is aware of. A very smart and subtle way the series liked to complement its world building was by including many supporting characters from the comics as secondary or minor characters throughout its episodes. Characters like Dr. Kafka, Emily Osborn, or Jean the Wolf. Throughout Season 1, we saw the introduction of many classic villains from Spidey's Rogues Gallery and their first battles with him, with the overarching mystery of who was the big man of crime in New York City, who was later revealed to be Tombstone. But a fun fact about this is that we almost didn't get to see him be included on the show. In that old IGN interview I mentioned earlier, Weisman also talked about how they were denied permission to use Kingpin on the series due to rights issues, so they chose to use a reworked version of Tombstone as a sort of compromise, admitting that if they had gotten permission to use Kingpin, they probably wouldn't have ended up using Tombstone. Though he doesn't regret this, since they really liked how they handled Tombstone in the final show. And I have to agree, since he was a really badass character and one of the best villains from the show, though it obviously would have also been really cool to see Kingpin in the Spectacular Spider-Man universe as well. The Green Goblin was the other major storyline from Season 1, and an important aspect of this adaptation of that story is how they seemingly first presented Harry Osborn as the real identity of the Goblin. This does take cues from the comics, since Harry also became the Green Goblin in traditional Marvel continuity, but there he became the Goblin after his father Norman Osborn had done so. As we all know though, Spectacular Spider-Man did eventually reveal that Norman was also the real identity of the Goblin in their universe, and that he had framed his own son as the Green Goblin to clear suspicion from him. But they misdirected the audience by presenting Harry as the quote-unquote real Goblin first, in order to confuse the audience and try to recreate the sense of mystery from the Green Goblin's original first appearance in the comics, since when the villain was first introduced during the Lee and Ditko run, they actually didn't immediately reveal who the Goblin was, and they played out the mystery over multiple issues before finally revealing that he was Norman Osborn. This is why they presented the Green Goblin storyline as a mystery in Spectacular Spider-Man, with many red herrings and misdirections. Besides all this, another fun scrapped idea from Season 1 was mentioned by Weisman in an old interview with Marvel Animation Age, where he said that in episode 6, they had planned a scene where Rhino thought about searching for Peter Parker in order to get to Spider-Man, since he's always taken pictures of him, so he actually starts going through every Peter Parker on the phone book, only for him to later knock down the door of an old blind African-American man who's also named Peter Parker, and when Rhino accuses him of being Peter Parker the photographer, the old blind guy just looks at Rhino and says, "Do I look like a photographer to you?" The scene was fully voiced and storyboarded, but it had to be cut from the episode due to time restraints. In that same interview, Weisman also said that they intended to include a subplot that focused on Ned Leeds and Betty Brant's growing romantic feelings for each other, but that was also cut, yet again due to time restraints, though he considered including it in a potential Season 3, and they did include hints at this story throughout the series.
I just have 2 questions for you, Betty. Do you think Peter Parker is Spider-Man? And would you go out with me Saturday night?
Christopher Yost, a fantastic writer who you might know as one of the main people responsible for Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, also mentioned on Twitter that he was originally considered to be the showrunner of Spectacular Spider-Man, but the job ultimately went to Greg Weisman, and this is awesome considering the many connections that both shows have, since the 2 series are considered by some to be set in the same shared universe, known to fans as the Yostverse. Christopher Yost didn't personally write any episodes of Spectacular Spider-Man, and he didn't have much involvement with the show itself, beyond being originally considered as a possible showrunner, but both shows became connected once Spider-Man appeared on an episode of EMH, and it was originally intended for that Spider-Man to be the same version as the one from Spectacular. I explained this in much more detail on my video about the rejected ideas and production history of EMH, so I suggest you check it out if you're interested in hearing more about that connection between the 2 shows. By the end of Season 2 of Spectacular Spider-Man, there were many potential future stories that were hinted at, as well as characters from the comics that had been introduced as their civilian identities, and the show's writers have gone on to confirm that they were introduced in order to expand on their storylines in a future Season 3 and beyond. In a similar fashion to how they introduced Quentin Beck into the show as an accomplice of the Chameleon in Season 1, and they later made him reappear as Mysterio on Season 2, and there are many characters that were low-key added onto the show, with whom they wanted to do this exact same thing, and expand on them in the future. A prominent secondary character that had been used in most of Season 2 was Dr. Miles Warren, who was introduced as a new scientist working at ESU's lab alongside Kurt and Martha Connors. Soon after though, Dr. Warren started showing his malicious true character once he begins working with criminals and aiding villains. We see him mutating Kraven into a beast, transforming Mark Allen into the Molten Man, and ultimately threatening Kurt Connors that he'd reveal the Lizard's true identity, forcing the Connors to move to Florida and allowing Miles Warren to take over ESU's lab. All of this was setting up Warren's eventual turn into the Jackal, who's mostly known by comic book fans as being the villain responsible for Spider-Man's infamous Clone Saga. And during an old 2009 IGN interview, Greg Weisman mentioned that they had big plans for Miles Warren, and that they intentionally introduced him in order to adapt storylines that were influenced by his comics, which also alluded to the possibility of Spectacular Spider-Man potentially adapting the Clone Saga in some manner had they continued. Also in 2009, there was a panel for the show during that year's Comic-Con, and in response to a fan asking if they had plans to introduce Ben Reilly, Weisman responded, "Well, we've got Miles Warren, we didn't put him in there for nothing." Another villain he mentioned in that Comic-Con panel was Carnage, and if you recall, during the show we did briefly saw Cletus Cassidy in a scene set in the Ravencroft Mental Institute.
That's encouraging news, Cletus. But it was Max's turn to speak.
Electro, Doc! Electro!
Hobie Brown was a minor character who appeared as a teenager that went to Peter's high school and played football, with a running gag where he wasn't allowed to have any speaking lines. In the comics, Hobie Brown is the civilian identity of the Prowler. Nowadays, most people are familiar with the Aaron Davis version of the Prowler due to the movies, but Hobie Brown was the first character to use that identity. And during the 4th episode of the 2nd season, we are briefly introduced to a man working for Norman Osborn called Morris Bench, who is actually the civilian identity of Hydro Man, yet another villain that was being set up for the future. In the 8th episode of the season, we saw a meeting of some of New York's most powerful people, mostly characters that had already been introduced beforehand, all except this character called Roderick Kingsley, who is one of the people who have taken up the mantle of the Hobgoblin in the comics. Greg Weisman also hosts a website mostly dedicated to his classic Gargoyle series, but in that website he has a section called Ask Greg, where he has responded to fan-submitted questions throughout the years. And in response to a fan's question, he directly confirmed that 2 major villains that would have appeared on a potential season 3 of the show would have been Hobgoblin and also the Scorpion, given that Mac Gargan had also been briefly alluded to during the series. Another character that was hinted at was Daniel Kingsley, the twin brother of Roderick, and another person who's taken up the identity of Hobgoblin. And many fans had already theorized that they would adapt both Kingsley brothers, since during the 8th episode there were many clues that Kingsley was acting as 2 different people. One of the most interesting plot details revealed in Season 2 was that Walter Hardy, the father of Black Cat, was actually the burglar who killed Uncle Ben. And this is something that would have deeply affected Black Cat's and Spidey's relationship, and would have been further developed in Season 3. 2 other very interesting minor characters used throughout the show were these 2 police officers. One of them was Gene the Wolf, a recurring NYPD detective from Spider-Man's comics, and the other was Stan Carter, another character from the comics. Gene the Wolf in the source material is usually shown to be mostly supportive of Spider-Man and his actions, though in this series they were first depicting her as being kind of skeptical of him. Stan Carter, on the other hand, is shown as supporting Spider-Man's actions, but also believing that he doesn't go far enough in punishing criminals.
Look, Sarge, we've been through this. Spider-Man means well, probably. But when he takes the law into his own hands, he goes too far.
You ask me, Spidey hasn't gone far enough.
This was alluding to the fact that, in the comics, Stan Carter eventually takes on the identity of Sin Eater, after becoming increasingly violent, deranged, and obsessed with killing people that he deemed to be sinners, with him actually being responsible for the death of Gene the Wolf. Now, one would think that Spectacular Spider-Man wouldn't be able to adapt Sin Eater or a story like The Death of Gene the Wolf, since it was mainly a show for younger audiences. But when Greg Weisman was directly asked about these 2 characters during an IGN interview, he actually said that they did want to adapt the Sin Eater storyline, saying that his original dream plans for the series would have been to make 65 episodes in total, showing Peter Parker's entire period at high school until he graduates, and after that he wanted to do direct-to-DVD movies following Peter's college years at ESU. Movies that would have had a more serious tone that allowed for more mature storylines akin to how DC was making their direct-to-DVD animated movies at the time. And man, the thought of an animated movie adaptation of The Death of Gene the Wolf set in the Spectacular Spider-Man universe sounds insane, and I would have absolutely loved to see that. Season 2 built upon the great foundation that the first season had laid down by making meaningful developments with its characters and storylines, and it continued being critically praised. However, it unfortunately went through a series of events that all contributed to its eventual cancellation. Spectacular Spider-Man's first season originally aired in the US on the CW's Kids WB programming block, but it later changed channels in the middle of Season 2's production due to internal changes at Marvel. This was around the time that Disney was nearing the completion of its acquisition of Marvel, and at that time Spider-Man's TV and movie rights were actually in the possession of Sony. However, around that time, Sony decided to mostly return Spider-Man's TV rights back to Marvel in order to receive some concessions for the production of the future live-action movies that they would do, meaning that from then on, Sony could continue producing Spider-Man's live-action films, and Marvel and Disney could start creating their own Spider-Man animated shows, which they eventually did. But part of this deal was that Spectacular Spider-Man's creative and distribution rights would still remain with Sony, given that the show was originally produced by Adelaide Productions, which is a direct subsidiary of Sony. So yeah, Spider-Man's and this show's rights issues are very complicated, But to make things even more complicated was that Spectacular Spider-Man actually changed TV networks from the CW to Disney XD starting from its second season. And to make things even worse, once the series began to be aired on Disney XD, it was kind of screwed over when releasing new episodes, airing them out of order and not advertising them properly. Season 2 also released internationally first, many months before in the US, leading to many fans viewing the show prior to it officially releasing in the US through piracy. Weisman talked about all this in an old interview with Marvel Animation Age when the second season was being aired in the US. All of this mismanagement from the network and rights negotiations ended up resulting in Spectacular Spider-Man not being renewed, with Disney XD later beginning to air a new series titled Ultimate Spider-Man. However, there are still many details from Spectacular Spider-Man's potential Season 3 that have been revealed in the years since the show's cancellation. For example, in response to a fan question, Greg Weisman revealed that they had plans to do a storyline involving Peter's parents, who in the series were said to have died on an accident alongside Eddie Brock's parents. Weisman has also said that Eddie Brock being institutionalized into the Ravencroft Institute would have also been followed up on a potential Season 3, so we would have possibly seen the return of Venom alongside the birth of the Carnage symbiote, since he was another villain confirmed for Season 3. In response to another fan question, Weisman also said that they had plans for a major storyline that would have detailed how Peter Parker first invented his web shooters. In another question that a fan had regarding Norman Osborn's mentorship of Peter throughout Season 2, Weisman commented that Norman being Peter's mentor would have had long-term implications that we didn't get to see, meaning that Norman was likely to reappear in Season 3 or another planned future season, given that in the final cliffhanger of the show we saw that he went into hiding disguising his appearance after his secret identity as the Green Goblin was revealed to the public. Something related to Norman's disappearance was that Emily Osborn was planned to have a larger role during Season 3 now that her husband was away. Tombstone would have also returned in Season 3, and Weisman has revealed that they intended on exploring the character's relationship with Robbie Robertson, since in the comics they have a history of being rivals ever since they were teenagers, and this rivalry was planned to be addressed in Spectacular Spider-Man. Weisman also answered a fan question that asked them if they had plans in adapting the story where John Jameson becomes Man-Wolf, and he said that they did have plans in telling a story that involved both John Jameson and also Kraven, who, as we previously mentioned, had already been transformed into a humanoid beast. Kraven's wife Calypso would have also made a comeback. Other characters who were planned to eventually appear in the series included Morbius, who had previously appeared in the 90s animated series, and also an old Spider-Man villain from his very early stories called the Crime Master, who Weisman mentioned during an interview with IGN, where he said that after the gang war we saw during Season 2, there would have been a power vacuum created in NYC's underworld, and that would have opened the field for new mob bosses to appear. It would have been really cool to see the Crime Master get adapted on Spectacular Spider-Man, since it would have cemented even further the show's deep influence and reverence for the old school period of Spidey's comic book history. In another interview with IGN, Weisman also said that while they mainly took inspiration from Spider-Man's more classic runs, they were also open to the idea of adapting newer characters as well, with him saying that Mr. Negative in particular was a modern villain that he really liked. So it's not like Mr. Negative was confirmed for Season 3 or anything, but who knows? If Spectacular Spider-Man were to return, we could see it adapt villains or storylines that were created during or after the show's conception. The Sinister Six would have also most likely reappeared during Season 3, and we would have seen new characters in the roster since Weisman has previously stated that they wanted to do a new Sinister Six iteration with each season. Weisman also said that he would have personally loved to do a musical episode, and he also told to IGN that he would have liked to adapt the boxing match between Peter and Flash Thompson from The Amazing Spider-Man number 8. Having other Marvel superheroes appear as guest characters on the show was also something they considered had the series continued. Weisman has said that he didn't want Spectacular to end up feeling like a team-up show, but during a 2008 interview with Comic Mix, he mentioned that they considered including other Marvel heroes such as the Human Torch, with him later elaborating on Twitter that they thought of having one guest hero per season, and Johnny Storm was the first they wanted to use, with Hulk and Captain America also being considered. Related to this, Matt Wayne, who was a writer for the show, also mentioned in an interview with Marvel Animation Age that he would have loved to use Power Pack as guest characters on the series had he gotten the chance, with a group of young heroes teaming up with Spider-Man. And in another interview, Matt Wayne mentioned that had the show gotten a season 3, he personally would have liked to introduce some cosmic characters, such as Gravity or Nova as guest heroes. Besides all of these planned villains and heroes we could have seen had the show continued, another thing from Spidey's comics that was considered to be adapted on the show was the Spider-Mobile, and I just love that. It might be a bit goofy and silly, but it could have been a nice gag. This show was legitimately pretty funny at times.
How? How are you always wherever I'm doing a job? What do you got, some kind of spider sense or something?
That's funny you should say that.
The series could be lighthearted and fun when it wanted to, but as we previously mentioned, Spectacular Spider-Man was planned to eventually get into darker and more serious storylines, especially if the series could achieve its dream scenario of making 65 total episodes, and following that up with a series of direct-to-DVD movies, with them actually planning on releasing movies set in between the end and the beginning of each season. And there is some more information we know about what we could have potentially seen. Stan Carter's turn as the Sin-Eater was something that Weisman mentioned most likely would have been adapted during one of these movies. But another storyline that would have been continued was what happened with the Connors family after moving away to Florida, as a result of Miles Warren blackmailing them. Weisman has commented that this would have been a spring break movie set between Season 2 and Season 3, showing Peter visiting the Connors in Florida as they continue to find a cure for Electro. And had that movie been a success, they wanted to make more movies set in between every season, right until the show ended, and they would have continued with more movies set in Peter's college years afterwards. Weisman has also implied that we eventually would have seen Peter and Mary Jane get married in one of these potential animated movies. Speaking of Peter's romantic interests, one very dark storyline that most likely would have been adapted during these more mature movies was the death of Gwen Stacy, with animation writer Michael Vogel tweeting a few years back that he had personally heard from Greg Weisman and Victor Cook what their original plans were for Gwen Stacy on the show, and it apparently would have been brutal, according to him. Honestly, even though I'd love to see Spectacular Spider-Man get revived for more episodes, I do think it's kind of unlikely, given that the show's rights still partially lie with Sony, and its original 2 seasons were directly produced by them. However, Marvel and Sony do seem to be able to come to terms and form a partnership when it comes to producing and distributing Spider-Man live-action movies. So, in theory, they could be able to also negotiate some kind of deal in order to make a Spectacular Spider-Man animated movie. What I'm saying is that it might be potentially very difficult for them to make an entire season's worth of 13 new episodes of the show, but it might be easier for them to make just one revival animated movie and see how that's received, with them potentially making more animated movies in the future if the first one proves to be a success. And I really do think if they revived Spectacular Spider-Man for an animated movie on Disney+, it'd be huge. People would go crazy for that. Of course though, some of you may be thinking about the last time we saw Spectacular Spider-Man get quote-unquote revived, technically, which was his short cameo scene during Across the Spider-Verse, where he tries to convince Miles Morales about the importance of canon events, and how every Spider-Man in every universe has to deal with the inevitable loss of a mentor in their lives, implying that the Captain Stacy of Spectacular Spider-Man eventually died. Now, although the scene served as a great dramatic moment in the film, and they did bring back Spectacular Spider-Man's voice actor, Josh Keaton, in order to reprise his role, and he did do a fantastic job just like in the show, they also didn't bring back anyone else from the show's staff, and Greg Weisman himself has gone on to clarify that he didn't know that the cameo was happening, nor did he have any involvement with the writing of that scene nor the movie in general. There's a great interview with him done by YouTube channel Spidey Dude Radio Network, which I'm gonna leave a link in the description because it's a great video that I suggest you check out. But there, Weisman said that he didn't feel like the Spider-Man voiced by Josh Keaton that appeared in that scene was actually the same Spidey from Spectacular Spider-Man, since he doesn't feel like their version of Peter would be on Miguel's side, trying to convince Miles that he should let his father die. He doesn't feel like the real Spectacular Spider-Man would have simply accepted Captain Stacy's death, essentially saying that the Spidey in that cameo scene was written out of character compared to how they wrote Spidey. So canon-wise, we can't assume that Captain Stacy was meant to ultimately die on Spectacular Spider-Man. We do have corroborated comments suggesting that Gwen would have probably died had the series continued, but we don't know about Captain Stacy. It still would have been very interesting to see how Gwen's storyline would have been adapted and her father's role in that story, especially since it was hinted at during the show that he knew that Peter was really Spider-Man.
Maybe a man in a mask doesn't have something to hide, but something to protect. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, sir.
It's crazy to think that even though Spectacular Spider-Man was cancelled more than 15 years ago, the show is still regarded as one of, if not the greatest and truest adaptation that Spider-Man has ever received. Its fantastic, nuanced writing, great character work, and real understanding of the source material's themes all combined to form what is essentially a huge love letter to Spider-Man and his world. This is why I think that a revival of this series could potentially work at any time. They could announce a revival tomorrow or 30 years from now, and people would still get excited, because this iteration of the character simply feels like Spider-Man in his purest form. Spectacular Spider-Man reiterates on its source material in a similar fashion to how shows like Batman the Animated Series or Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes combined the best elements from their comic book history and pretty much nailed all characterizations in their depictions, resulting in a new version of these worlds that feel truly timeless and everlasting. Oh yeah, you heard me, I just called Spectacular Spider-Man timeless. And I think that a lot of you might agree on that. So in my opinion, there will never be a bad time to revive the show. And hopefully, in that hypothetical scenario, they're also able to get the same creative staff to return, since their fantastic work and dedication was responsible for one of the greatest comic book adaptations we've ever seen. So yeah, I love Spectacular Spider-Man. And if you watch until the end of this video, I'm willing to bet that you also love the show. So I won't mind asking if you would like to see the show get a revival. But tell me, what would you like the most? Would you like to see Spectacular Spider-Man get a whole new revival animated series? Or would you prefer to see a more mature revival animated movie instead? What planned ideas that we went over would you have liked to see? I personally would have loved to see Sin Eater, Hobgoblin, and the Scorpion finally get adapted in the series world, and also Norman Osborn's return, and just so that I could finally get over that goddamn cliffhanger. But please, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching.